Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and I figured in this video I'd give you guys some advice about winter hiking and snowshoeing. Even though I have a lot of experience hiking in general, and you might too, it's totally different as far as hiking in the mountains, especially in higher elevations in winter. It could be much more dangerous because, of course, you have the possibility of avalanches, getting lost because you can't find the trail in the snow, and things like hypothermia are a bigger possibility. So I'll give some basic tips on like how to stay warm, which trails I'd recommend to take in winter, and when to use snowshoes or micro spikes. So while this video might be for people who want to hike more in winter, it could also be really helpful for anyone because you could get hit with a snowstorm almost all of the year, especially at high elevations in like Colorado or some of the places I've been in China. You could get snow into June and as early as September. So if you're going out in spring and you're thinking, oh, it's really nice and warm out, and you get up to some high elevation, you get hit with snow and you get blinded or lose the trail. Or even in, like September, you could be hiking, it could be really warm out, and you get hit by unexpected cold rain and snow, and you could die of exposure from hypothermia. So I'll also go into some of the pros and cons of hiking in winter. So if this video helps, like and subscribe, and let's get into it. So some of the pros of hiking in winter, one good thing is there's definitely a lot less people out there. So if you really don't like crowds, it could be, a good way to experience nature with hardly any people. I mean, there's definitely some on popular trails, but much less. It's really quiet out there. There's hardly any wildlife since most of the animals are hibernating at that time or in other areas. The big cons are obviously it's more dangerous. You could get hit with an avalanche, you could lose your trail, you get really cold out there, especially if the weather changes or it's super windy. And you're also just going to have to bring more equipment because you're probably going to need snowshoes or micro spikes some of the time, and hiking poles and a few other things. So, and plus all the extra clothes that you need that you don't really need in summer. So I've been hiking a lot in the winter in Colorado for the last 6 months, and it's been a great learning experience. They've had a ton of snow this past season in 2022, 2023. And I've also done some high altitude hikes to one or two of the 14ers. And so I've learned how to judge the weather and the elevation and things like that, because all of those things are really important. One of the most dangerous experiences I could have had with snow was actually a couple years ago when I was in China. I did a trip in May, and it was out in the very far western part of Sichuan near Tibet, and I planned like a 4 or 5 day one-way trip. So I left my van in one area, and I was basically going to go to like another town. I'd have to get a ride back. And, the weather wasn't too bad. It was May, so, it was still cool at night and a little cold, but it was generally pretty good that whole, couple of weeks I was hiking around. And I hiked out for that whole day. I was by a big lake. And yeah, I heard in the middle of the night, I knew it was snowing. And yeah, when I got up, it was like almost a foot of snow. And so obviously I changed my plans. I went back. And when I was going back, as the snow melted, I had to go over a hill to get to my van. And with wet snow at a steep angle, it was super hard to get up without constantly slipping. So I realized that I needed micro spikes to get traction, not just for wet snow, but when people pack down a trail, you're going to need micro spikes because it's super icy and slippery. And so I was thinking of that trip, and I was like, wow, like if I had gone another day and tried to come back even higher elevation and I didn't have any good equipment with me, it definitely could have been bad. In September, there was a guy in Colorado that got killed hiking up to Long's Peak, which is in Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm sure he had some experience because he's from this area, and I saw in the article he had hiked some 14ers and stuff. And, in September in Denver, it's super warm still. It could be 90 degrees, and so you go out for a hiking trip, and at the base of the mountain, it's, relatively warm. But, Denver's 5,000 feet. The base of the mountain's, 10,000 feet, and then you're going up to like 14. And so by the time you get up to the top, the weather up there could be freezing, and he did get hit with a storm. I don't know if it was just cold rain or some snow. He couldn't find the trail, and a couple days later they found him. So it's really tragic, but that's why it's good to learn these circumstances at high elevation in cold weather. So before you go hiking in any season, I would check out the forecast. And I'm not just talking about the town you're going to. They actually have a good website that's mountainforecast.com. And that tells you like the actual weather on top of the peak and different levels of the peak. So like it might have the peak is 14,500 feet. It will also have maybe like 12,000 feet. And it'll have the wind, the temperature, the wind chill, and all that stuff. So if you're doing peaks, definitely look at that. And also look at, the closest towns to where you're going. Don't just look at like, oh, what's Denver's weather going to be like? But you're driving 2 hours away to the mountains, So if you can't find the peak forecast, at least look at a town close by. So, of course, the temperature is a big deal, and that changes as you get to higher elevations. It's going to get, obviously, a lot colder. And then winds are another huge factor. I mean, you could be hiking in general at like 25 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about -5 degrees Celsius. And that might not be too bad for the whole day. But if you get 30, 40 mile per hour winds, it's hard to be outside for more than an hour, especially if you're above tree line. I did a hike a few weeks ago with a couple, and we really didn't have too far to get up to this 13,000 foot peak, but those winds were just insane. And so, we got up to the saddle and then we turned back, but the wind is really a big factor with a lot of things out there. And plus that'll cover up the track. So if you hike out for a ways and you come back, you might not even be able to see where you're going. So obviously if you're not in the mountains and you're on a flat area, you're safer. You don't have to deal with the avalanches, but there's still things you'd have to be careful. Like you could still fall into a pond or the water or something like that, but at least you don't have the elevation issues. So flat areas can be safer, but you could still lose your tracks or get lost. So just consider that. So at least in Colorado, and I'm sure most other places with higher elevations, the snow doesn't really melt that much in the winter. Like I live in Denver and it snows, and within a day or two, almost all the snow is gone. Well, that's at 5,000 feet. In the mountains where it's 10 to 14,000 feet, that snow just builds a whole winter. So it's at least 3 feet or so, and more depending on the area and the wind, because the wind gusts can blow areas that'll, create these huge mountains of snow. I hike up to this area, Crater Lakes, near Netherland all the time, and the wind blows heavy on that lake. And the first time I went up there, it was getting, a few feet of snow. Then it was like 10 feet of snow. And then, the snow drifts ended up being like 25, 30 feet. So some areas just get piled on with snow. So even if there's only, let's say, 3 feet of snowfall, it doesn't mean it's all only 3 feet everywhere. The wind will create huge snow drifts. So what equipment do you need if you want to hike in deeper snow? It depends on the situation, but you're generally going to want snowshoes and micro spikes for sure, and hiking poles. Snowshoes are basically meant to help you so you don't post hole. Post hole is basically like falling into the snow really deep, because you step into the snow and you just fall up to your knees or your waist. So the snowshoes have a wider surface, so it prevents you from falling all the way down. Now, this doesn't mean that you're like floating on the snow. You definitely could still get really deep, but it usually will prevent you from getting super, super deep. But like I said, I've had situations where it just is so deep that you still go to your waist in snow. So it's still only helpful in many circumstances, but not all of the circumstances. Sometimes you're just going to have to go back. You're just not going to be able to get through super deep snow. Micro spikes, always bring them no matter what if there's snow, because they're super light anyway. Like, one of the reasons why I don't always want to bring the snowshoes is because the pair I have is pretty cheap and it's kind of heavy. So if I don't need them, I won't bring them. But micro spikes are super light. Like, they're only, they're less than a pound anyway. And so they easily strap over your boots. And like I said, you use them when the snow's packed down and icy or it's wet snow. Almost any circumstance, they're going to be pretty helpful for you. Because if you get in these areas where it's packed snow and there's a lot of elevation up and down, if you just have regular boots on, it doesn't matter if you've got good tread or not, you're just going to slip and fall right down. I see it all the time in Rocky Mountain National Park and places. So you definitely want to bring micro spikes. They're only like $15. So definitely pack that with you. So what trails should you choose to go to or avoid? So now in the summer, some of the popular trails you don't want to even consider because there's a million people out there. And so it's kind of the opposite in the winter in a way, because if you do go to the very remote trails, there's almost no one that hikes them, and you're going to have to make the trail yourself, which means that, you know, at the beginning it's generally not too bad. Like maybe it's only about a foot of snow. I found the further I get, after about, you know, a mile or two, the snow just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And maybe at the beginning you have some idea where the trail is, but like in Colorado, they don't mark the trees or anything, so you have no idea where the trail is. So you're creating your own trail, which, you know, would generally not be that bad, but on a regular trail, you know, there's not like huge logs and rocks on it. It's, you know, it's pretty decent, where if you're making your own trail, you can't see where all the trees that are falling down and all the huge rocks and holes and different things. So that already makes it tougher. And then when you're trying to come back, if it's super windy or snowy, you might not even be able to see the trail you just worked so hard to make. Because at least if you could see the trail, you could walk on your same footsteps back. But if the wind blows it over, you've got all that work again. Which is another reason why, you know, I would say, like, for instance, if you're doing a 6-mile trail in summer and that takes you 3 hours, in winter it's already going to take longer because of the snow, even if it's a little packed down. If the trail is not there at all, I would say it would take like 3 times longer. Like, I would say that would take at least all day, or it wouldn't even be possible after about halfway. On certain angles on the mountain I've been, the snow just gets so deep it's not even possible. So you got to keep that in consideration if you are doing these longer hikes and you want to go out for like 2 days and you hike out and you might not think it takes that long, and then you end up coming back, and that evening you might get hit with a snowstorm and winds. The next day you're like, holy shit, like, you know, I came out here, it wasn't too bad. Now I've got a much longer trip back. So you got to factor in all these things, which is, to be honest, why I would recommend just going for like day trips on places you're already somewhat used to and you have some experience on. I wouldn't go for too many like multi-day trips unless you're really experienced. Maybe one day out and then camping and coming back's okay, but I wouldn't say much further than that if you don't have a lot of experience. So, as I said, in the summer I avoid the crowded places. In the winter, I want to go to some places which has some traffic, because I want some people to blaze that trail. And then I generally only need to use the micro spikes. But it's still good to have the snowshoes at some point, because sometimes I want to get up to, let's say, a lake, and someone made the trail almost the whole way, like 4/5 of the way. And then you get there and you're like, shit, it's like 2.5, 3 feet of snow. And without snowshoes, it's much harder. So I would just pay more money if you have the extra funds and get the ultralight snowshoes and just almost always have them with you, unless you like always do a trail and it hasn't snowed in a long time and you're well aware that it's packed down. But I definitely don't go on trails anymore where like almost no one goes to, because it's just going to be too deep. So another big thing you have to check out is how dangerous it is as far as the avalanche warnings. So you could look online on a website that has all the avalanche detail of what level it is, whether, I think it goes from like 1 to 5. And that's one way you can determine it. But that's kind of general too. So the chances are is that on a hike, many areas could be safe, but then other areas might be really dangerous. So you're going to have to be able to read the situation a bit. Obviously, areas that are super steep, like over 30 to like 45 degrees and up, if it's super steep, that could obviously slide down. And avalanches happen most right after a heavy snowstorm. And also once the snow starts to melt in spring, it gets really heavy and it'll slide down the mountain. So my best advice to you is, like, just don't go anywhere where it looks like there could be a chance of an avalanche near you. You know, if there's some huge steep slope next to you, that's obviously dangerous. Now, if you're in a wooded area, the trees, I think, kind of hold the snow together a little bit better. There's a little bit less of a chance, but above those tree line, you could still get an avalanche that falls and will come through there. So just kind of know the terrain or go into familiar places. You can take a course about avalanches through the American Institute of Avalanche Research Education. And it's kind of complicated. You dig out this big area and then you like slightly tap it and then harder. And there's a few different techniques, but it's a little bit complicated. And I think the people that need that the most are people doing more backcountry skiing, because most of the people who do die in avalanches are usually backcountry skiers. I think Colorado has one of the most in the United States. They get an average of about 6 a year. And it's because a lot of these skiers trigger a lot of avalanches. And so I think Colorado had over 6 this year. A couple people died on snowmobile accidents, and then occasionally hikers die, but not quite as much. But I just wouldn't hike, in areas where it seems dangerous or there's warnings. Of course, make sure you have the GPS and the maps of where you're going on your phone. Now, if you're going for more than a day or something like that, you're going to want to have paper maps. And plus, to be honest, even your phone, even if it normally lasts all day, in the cold, it doesn't last as long. And you might slip or drop it in water or something like that. You might lose access to your GPS and your map that you had on your phone. So you're going to want to have maybe a paper copy, especially if it's not somewhere you're familiar with. If you know the area and you're only going for, 2 or 3 hours, it's not a big deal. I go to the same places all the time. I know how to get in and out. But if you're going into uncharted areas where you haven't been before, bring a paper copy and a compass. Because if you get out in an area for 1 or 2 days, you're really far out, you get hit with a storm and your phone doesn't work, good luck getting out. I think even if you have decent skills with directions, it's still really dangerous. If you are going to go out to some of these backcountry areas or several days or any area that's really dangerous, I'd get one of these safety beacons where, if you push it, it could send an emergency signal to, the police or the emergency rescue people, and they could be able to help you out. The thing with that is they are a few $100s, and I think you have to get a subscription that you pay every month. But that could be the meaning of life or death. So if you're going to do any of these dangerous things like backcountry skiing, snowshoeing and stuff, and it might be dangerous, I definitely invest in one of those too. Make sure you have hiking poles. I always recommend hiking poles whether you're in the snow or not. They're super good for balance and keeping you from slipping and falling. Make sure you have baskets on the bottom of your poles, so when you stab into the ground, it's not like a spear. It stops from, your pole going real deep into the snow. If you are walking on a packed trail, stay on the packed trail. You can walk to the side if you want, and you're going to step right up to your knee, at least. So just stay on the packed area. Obviously, make sure you have a lot of warm clothing, like various layers, because sometimes you're getting kind of hot and you want to take off a layer, you're getting kind of cold, but you don't want a big heavy jacket, so you just want one layer. So I usually have, let's say, a t-shirt, a long sleeve shirt, a sweatshirt, a light jacket, and then maybe a heavy jacket. It depends on the circumstance. You're going to obviously want a hat and a scarf, maybe one of these ski masks, gloves. Ski goggles are great in the wind because sunglasses will still get a lot of wind and your eyes could get really cold in the wind. So have some ski goggles, especially if you're above tree line. Plus, it's just crazy sunny out here, especially in Colorado. Like, when the sun hits the snow, it's super bright. If you're going to do any 14ers, it's obviously going to be super cold for the most part. Have hand and foot warmers, those packs that they're heated for, like 10 hours or something. They do have electric gloves, socks, and boots. I've used those, but those are usually good for a few hours. So that's good for like the day, but not good for like a multi-day trip necessarily. If you are going for a few days, I'd bring the extra pouches, the hand warmers and foot warmers. If your hands get super cold still, I usually take off my gloves and I put my hands under my armpits. Back in the day when I was a little kid, I did a paper route for a few years in Buffalo, New York. My hands were freezing all the time. I had to constantly stop. And it's not comfortable because your armpits are frozen when your hands hit them. But that's one way that, it'll warm them up. And then I put my gloves back on and just keep going. Really check the wind on those hikes because it's probably going to be in the teens. Or it might even be warmer, but as soon as you get above tree line and those big winds hit, which is real common, that's going to be a different story. So I wouldn't recommend doing it in winds that are over like 20 or so. So some other dangers, obviously ponds and lakes and rivers are dangerous. Of course, if you fell through in the middle of nowhere and, you know, you're a few hours from your car, like, you could get hypothermia in 15, 20 minutes and die, especially if you can't even get out of the hole you're in. You could walk out on some of these lakes and they're frozen, but rivers don't freeze as easily because they're moving. And same thing with, if you're at an alpine lake, there's usually a little area where, you know, the lake has a runoff and it goes down into a river. That area is probably not frozen, and the snow on top of it can actually act like a insulator. So I stepped off kind of near a lake. I didn't even want to go on the lake anyway, and I was like, oh, it's got to be frozen by now. It's been so cold. And I stepped through and fell in, and I mean, luckily it was only a foot of water, and I was okay. But if that was a little deeper, or I was really far away and it was colder, it could have been a bigger deal. So that's another danger you have out there, is not just near the alpine lakes, but anywhere where there's a river or creek. Now, of course, when there's a river, it's probably going to be kind of obvious because it'll just be a very flat area, like in a gully or in a ravine or something like that. You could probably assume or have some idea if it's a big river. But if it's a really kind of smaller creek or something like that, you might walk down into an area and expect to walk out, and you might fall straight through. So that's another danger. You're going to have to really be careful that you don't cross these creeks and fall in. I was walking the other day, and it's spring now. We're in mid-April in Colorado, and we walked in a certain way, and it was okay. When we came back out, the one guy fell through with his foot, and I even mentioned to the girl, I was like, just go back, and she thought she probably could do it, and she fell through up to her knees, or even higher. I mean, I think almost to her waist. Luckily, I pulled her out, and it was okay. We were right near the car, but that would have ruined your day if you're going out and in the first, 20 minutes you fall in, to your knees and your feet are wet. And of course, if you're several miles away, that could be much more dangerous. So in spring, you have to be real careful too, because the snow's still pretty deep, but there could be a lot of areas where you could fall through. I generally wouldn't even really walk on those lakes. I mean, in some touristy areas, like at Rocky Mountain National Park, I see hundreds of people doing it, and it's fine, I'm sure, because the park rangers and people wouldn't let people on if it was dangerous. But if you're out there alone, I wouldn't even consider it. I mean, there's no benefit to it other than you might die. There's tons of people on snowmobiles every year in many places around the world who go out and they go across a huge lake and they fall through and die. So it's just not worth it. So anyway, I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, like and subscribe. And I've got a lot of other things on this channel, from my hiking trips around the world, biking trips, motorcycle trips, fishing in Alaska, my time in the Army, living in China and Taiwan for 15 years, and other trips around the world. So you can check those things out too. Good luck out there, and be safe and take care. Cheers.